Hi there everyone. So this is a re-recording of the Module 2 synchronous learning session. So the reason for that one is because I was not able to record any of the synchronous learning sessions. Also, there are a little bit more things that I would like to discuss that were not discussed in the synchronous learning session due to the lack of time. So with that one, we'll be beginning with the introduction to paperless animation. So for this one, it's an entirely new thing because we will be talking about a new medium that is not really done previously. We might have done it previously before, little bits and pieces over here, but this is going to be the full introduction. We'll be talking quite a lot of things. So we have the types of animation, a short introduction to paperless animation. We also have our animation workflow and our materials, particularly that of a drawing tablet and your animation software, particularly Krita. So for this one, we have first of all the types of animation. For you to understand what paperless animation is, you need to be able to understand that there are different types of animation, not only according to medium that we're going to have right now, but in terms of a lot of properties. So we always have character animation versus effects animation, which is different types of animation again. We also have according to the geographical area or the influences or the drawing styles, particularly Western animation versus Japanese animation. For today, we'll be talking only about the medium. So we have six, and then a seventh one for the hybrid, which is essentially a mishmash of these different other types of animation. So with that one, let's head on first with our first type of animation, something that you are familiar with, which is traditional animation. So for traditional animation or hand-drawn animation, this is of course the oldest form of animation. It is called as traditional because almost everything in the animation production, particularly your keyframing, in-betweening, and cleanup, was done by hand and without any computer tools. There might be some computer tools a little bit more recently, around the 1990s. However, that would be only limited to scanning and compositing and rendering. A lot of the times you would see them more into they will be using more of pencil and paper compared to more computer tools. Traditional animation usually uses something which we call as cell animation, which comes from the word cell, which is these types of plastic sheets, plastic acetate sheets that are used for the final scanning, inking, and coloring. So this is kind of how it looks like. So we have right here an ink layer. So you're going to have to first draw the ink layer, which is based of a final pencil layer that has been cleaned up through paper. So that's just going to be traced on the acetate. And then it's going to be flipped over, and then you have the paint right here, which is usually acrylic paint. So the purpose of having cell animation is for us to be able to have this sort of layering. So it has already been established that in an animation production, not one person will do everything in the scene. So it's not like one person will be doing all four characters and the background and some of the background characters and objects that are in the scene. Usually, only one person is assigned to one character, and then another person will be assigned to backgrounds and such like that. A way for you to be able to make sure that all of these things are placed into one sequence, you would have to layer them. So layering is much easier if you have the other places that are not necessary as clear, which is what the acetate does. So you have your acetate right here, which is usually placed on top of your background plate, which is usually at the very bottom part. It can get as many layers as necessary, depending on the number of characters or the number of objects that are in the scene. Another thing that is quite unique to traditional animation, particularly really old traditional animation before computer times, is that when they are scanning and when they are compositing, that's usually just one step. You don't really see a lot of steps wherein you would have a separate compositing phase and a separate rendering phase that is usually placed in one. The reason for that one is because the scanning already makes it before you're able to scan, it has already been composited and then it's essentially being rendered real time. Rendering is not really the correct term because you're not really rendering, you're just going to take a photo, which is done by this. So we have a short GIF, which I'll be turning here into video. So for this one, let's look into this part first, wherein we have our clear acetate sheets on the upper left side, which is arranged for the scanner or for the compositor, so to speak, for them to be able to place it on the frame without any distractions whatsoever. And then they're going to place it on top of this plate. So if you're going to look into the plate, there are some important things. So of course, you have your clear acetate sheet, which is clear except for the character itself. Another one is the background. So the background usually isn't really placed squarely, or it doesn't have the same dimensions rather as that of the final dimension of the film. So it's a bit wider, as you can see. So the purpose for that one is because a lot of the animations tend to use lockdown shots or tracking shots instead of just having the background in place. So that would be easier in terms of the animators, so that they won't really have to focus on the placement of the characters. It would be just easier for them to move the background every now and then. And then afterwards, you're going to see right here that there is a glass thing that pushes down, which will then record this entire photo. So it's essentially taking a photo. So this glass plane right here isn't necessarily the scanner. There's an overhead camera right here which takes the photo. So the purpose of this glass thing over here is more of to flatten the image and make sure that it's consistent. There's no bumps within the paper or the acetate, so that it has just one clear, consistent photo. Now let's move on to some examples. So as we've stated a while ago, a lot of these traditional animations is the dominant type of animation before we had the age of computers, so around the early 1900s, and then up until we have Disney animated films until the Renaissance. Upon the Renaissance period, they still use predominantly traditional animation, but now integrated computer technology around, like let's say the coloring phases, scanning, compositing phases. We also have Warner Brothers TV shows, which are 50s, 40s animation, so they would be used without the assistance of computer tools. And then we also have early Studio Ghibli films, particularly that of Grave of the Fireflies, and anything that is before the 1990s. Next one we have here paperless animation. So for paperless animation, this is considered as a mix of traditional and digital animation. So this will be explained a little bit more in depth later, but essentially all of the techniques in traditional animation are used here, except it is now done digitally. So instead of you drawing in pen and paper, you would be using a computer and a drawing tablet or a mouse. So it can be done for almost all of these stages. So you have keyframing, in-betweening, cleanup, coloring, shading, and highlighting. So the main advantage of paperless animation is that it allows for efficiency and lesser resources, and then it can also still get that feel and impact that is provided by traditional animation. So a little bit more on that one later. This is not really seen technically in a lot of animations today, but if ever you were to see it, it's more of small studio animations or Japanese animations in relation to traditional animation. So you don't really see a lot of animations that would just be purely paperless. That would be quite rare within the industry. It would mostly be used together with traditional animation as a base, and then it would be enhanced further through the use of paperless animations. So let me just Google search something quickly right now just to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. So we have one of the best examples that I can really think of is this one, the season 1 animation for Attack on Titan. So for this one, it's just going to be a simple animation, but it's a way for me to be able to showcase to you how it's supposed to look like. So we have right here thicker lines, and we also have here thinner lines. So that is the way on how you can kind of see that it's paperless animation instead of any other animation. So let's try to see why it is used in traditional animation usually. So usually the base right here is traditional animation, and you can see that through the cleanup. If you were to notice right here around the right side where the eyes and the nose are, so there's this very thin line. You also can see it towards the hair strands around the right side, not so much on the left side. So you can see that the lines right here are thinner. They tend to look a little bit more porous, meaning that the lines don't really look very solid. They almost look like a little bit gray, and they kind of look a little bit more. It has some dots to it, so it's not a clean, concise line. So this is an effect of traditional animation because pencil isn't really something that's solid. So once you have scanned it and if you don't do any adjustments to it, tendency is you would get this type of look. But if you're going to see for some of the other lines, like let's say, let's focus on the left side right here. So you have we have the color of the jacket right here, and then we also have our hair strands. Very dominantly, you also see it right here on the jawline. It has thicker lines compared to that one of the one right here. So that is an example of paperless animation. You can tell that it's paperless animation. Number one, it tends to have thicker lines. Number two, it's darker, much darker than what you can achieve with pencil cleanup. So for pencil cleanup, if this were a bit thicker and it was pencil animation, you would still have that porous kind of characteristic. But this one is solid, so you can see that one. Another characteristic and kind of a dead giveaway as well for paperless animation is these stick lines don't really look consistent. So if you actually look into it, they're not really the same thickness through and through. One thing that I can see right here is around the jawline right here. So you can see that it kind of gets thicker as it moves towards the end of the timing chart. So that is an example of paperless animation. It's not really something that's bad in terms of inconsistency of thickness. It can be something that is more of a stylistic choice. However, as we have known previously, it's not really something that we would recommend unless it is stated by the animation studio. And it would also be really difficult for you to maintain the consistency for this one. Now let's move on to two-dimensional animation. So two-dimensional animation is also known as vector animation or flash animation, based on the main software that we use. So unlike for traditional and paperless animation wherein you're going to draw the characters from scratch, you tend to use a digital puppet for you to be able to do the animation. So a digital puppet kind of looks like this. It's still two-dimensional, but it's still a puppet. So you have this entire character, but this character isn't really drawn as one unit. It's actually drawn according to separate parts. So like let's say according to usually how it would move. So you have probably the face. Under the face you have a hair which is separate. You have your eyes and eyebrows is separate. You have the mouth is separate. The neck would be an entirely different entity for your torso. That's one thing. We also have for the arm, even though that you can see it's one consistent arm, you also have differences right here. So you might have, of course, your upper arm, you have your lower arm, and then you have your hand. So the way on how you're going to manipulate it is through an idea which we call as rigging. So rigging is essentially moving the different body parts or replacing them in the case of your facial expressions. So if ever you're going to move them, it is connected through the system of bones. So these bones would help aid you in terms of how it's going to move. So for example, if you're going to move your lower arm, you're going to move it according to the elbow right here. So you're not just going to rotate it based on the center of the shape, because essentially these are shapes. If ever there is a need for replacement, that could be possible by having a library of different body parts and expressions, as well as different views. So for example, if your character is a bit twisted, you need to have a separate library for 3/4 views, and then you have a separate library for front view. So with that one, it is a bit easier, particularly when you want to make faster animations for simpler character designs, because you don't have to draw everything from scratch. All you really have to do is to manipulate different parts of the body. However, it doesn't guarantee that you will just be manipulating body parts 100%. You are still required to draw some of them, particularly when you have difficulties in terms of the movement of the joints or the limbs. So good examples for that one is around the shoulders right here and around the hips right here. So if ever the legs are moving, there might be some instances that the crotch would not be able to cover it. So you need to be able to add a shape, or you need to be able to draw some parts for you to be able to fill up that space. This is usually used, however, for a lot of animation projects that tend to have a simpler character design. This is also the reason why you don't really see this a lot in Japanese animation, because Japanese animation tend to have um, character designs that tend to be more human-like and have a lot of intricacies in terms of muscles, body composition. So with that one, it might be a little bit difficult for you to do something like this. Whereas for Western animation, wherein the legs and the arms are a bit simpler. It's just a series of basic shapes, so it's easier for you to be able to manipulate. As a result of that one, most of the Western cartoons tend to use this type of animation. And you would see this a lot in the industry actually. You would tend to see either 2D animation or traditional animation more than paperless animation. Next one we have here stop motion. So stop motion involves the manipulation of real-world objects. This can usually be physical objects, but now has recently included digital objects. So that can be pixels and so on and so forth. So the main motion of stop motion is you're able to do this by moving objects slightly and then photograph one frame at a time. So it kind of sounds like a digital puppet, which is very similar to that of 2D animation. But the main difference between stop motion animation and 2D animation is that stop motion uses straight ahead animation strictly, whereas for 2D animation, they can either use straight ahead and post to post animation, usually post to post animation. Stop motion would depend according to the materials that you're using, but essentially the steps are the same. So the first one is claymation, and we also have puppeting right here. So I'll be explaining them both because they're quite similar and they have key differences. So claymation utilizes more malleable objects like, let's say, plasticine or clay. Puppeting also has plasticine and clay, but the main difference for this one is that puppets tend to have a skeleton base or rig. Claymation doesn't necessarily have those. So the advantage of having a skeleton base and rig for puppeting is that you can move certain body parts, kind of like a puppet, instead of replacing the entire model. Whereas for claymation, you can have some sort of rigging or moving of body parts, but that's very rare. And tendency is that you would have to change the model entirely rather. So if ever you're going to create a walk cycle for claymation, you need 8 models for the 4 poses times 2. For puppeting, you just need 1 because you just need to be able to manipulate the limbs if necessary. For claymation, it is better in terms of mimicking that traditional animation feel wherein you need to have squashes and stretches and exaggerations that might not be possible for puppeting. Technically, puppeting is able to do that, but it will be a little bit more difficult. And again, for puppeting, it's much easier in terms of the production time and production budget because you don't have to make so many models and you don't have to replace them every now and then. So we have right here, to kind of give you the reason why you can't really puppet this is more of the design. So for example, the characters for Chicken Run or Aardvark Studio animations, if you can see the main character right here in this animated photo right here, you can see that the limbs, so your arms and your legs, they can kind of move, but not the entirety of your arms. I mean, not the entirety of your legs. So you can see right here around portions of the thighs, wherein it's not really moving. So with that one, if in case you would need a more extreme motion, you would have to change the model entirely. Whereas for puppeting, you can see that the design is more or less a bit more skinny. You have longer limbs for you to be able to accommodate that manipulation. One more thing about puppeting, you can't necessarily just do it by manipulating it entirely. You still need to replace some of the body parts, particularly that of facial expressions. Next one, we have pixel animation. So this is more of photograph animation, wherein you utilize real people and real environments for you to be able to create these outrageous videos. So you might have seen these ones within your lifetime. And then the last one for stop motion is cutout. So for cutout, it utilizes flat characters, props, and backgrounds which are using paper, card, fabric, or photos. So this can also be done digitally, similar to that of your 2D animation by creating figures with joints and then simulating it on a computer. Again, the main difference for this one is that for 2D animation, you can do post to post, but for cutout, it is usually strictly straight ahead animation. You can also see quite a little bit of difference in terms of how it is created. For 2D animation, you can see a little bit of shadowing right here. So it's not entirely flat. You can add shading and highlighting, but not as much as traditional or paperless or even 3D animation. Whereas for cutout animation, it's usually entirely flat, so you don't see any shadowing. So with this one, it would prevent any type of disturbances that can be created when you're doing cutout animation. They just remove the shading entirely most of the time. So you might even see some instances wherein the background doesn't necessarily blend with the character, which is something that's quite usual with cutout animation. This is also usually the animation type of choice for a lot of Western animations, like the one that we have for Rick and Morty. We have right here three-dimensional or 3D animation or CGI animation. This is the animation of choice for feature films currently. Also, it is used for live action films and animation in video games if necessary. So similar to that of 2D animation, it also utilizes a character rig or digital puppet. So with this one, it still uses a boning channel. It still uses these different types of moving mechanisms, but for this one, it's a little bit more intricate. Firstly is that for 2D animation, you're not really required to have a boning channel. So for some studios, they don't really require that one, so that might be a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, you have a little bit more freedom. Whereas for 3D animation, there is a strict boning system, so it's quite necessary for you to follow movements, and it is possible for you to be a little bit more impeded with 3D animation comparing to that of 2D animation. Second of all is you have something which we call as kinematics and inverse kinematics that may not be present when you're doing 2D animation. So inverse kinematics and kinematics is more of the movement of your body parts and how it would affect other body parts. So we have here an example. The one that is moving right now is the eyebrow, and that would usually affect the skin around it. So you can see the skin on the top of the left eyebrow right here. It is a bit more squashed, so it's a bit more defined, whereas the skin at the bottom of the eyebrow is stretched. So that's another thing. There is also a possibility that the eyelid would go a bit higher compared to that of the other eye because of the moving eyebrow and, of course, other movements of the skin. So that's one thing that we have to take into consideration when we're using a digital puppet for 3D animation. It is also usually a technically intensive process and would usually need a number of separate specialists. So aside from the person who will be doing the character designing and rigging, there would also be a specialist usually for the visual effects. There would be a person who would focus on simply simulations, particularly particle simulations and hair simulations. One really good example is also in this movie, which is Moana. They have a lot of simulation programs which just focus on the hair and on the water. We also have for the lighting, just for the lighting, how it would reflect, how these characters would reflect light, how they would react to shadowing. Also the texturing, that's another person who will be doing it. So when it comes to 3D animation, it is also a little bit easier, but it's also quite intensive if you really want to create a convincing 3D animation. That is also why it's the animation of choice that can be integrated to 3D movies, and it can even look as real as the real thing. So main examples that we have right here is, of course, Pixar movies. They strictly have 3D animation movies. We also have DreamWorks movies, which is, I think, more or less the pioneer of 3D animation, as one of the pioneers of 3D animation, but they do have 2D and traditional animation movies. We also have Marvel movies, so any character that you see that is somewhat out of this world is an example of or is a result of 3D animation. So you have Thanos, you have the Incredible Hulk. A lot of the costumes also are through 3D animation. So for this one, it also takes into consideration it takes into consideration as well how the characters would move and how they're going to then place it on a 3D model, which is also similar to that of game animation. So you have that Norman Reedus game and Cyberpunk 2077 for the simulation of these real life actors. Next one, we have motion graphics. So I think this is the second to the last. Motion graphics mostly focuses more on images, logos, texts, or video clips. So the main purpose of motion graphics is really more of informing and enticing other people. Usually, the main purpose of the other animations is more of entertainment, but for motion graphics, it really is used almost exclusively for information dissemination as well as for commercials. You can also use it more as an entertainment kind of sort, but that's not really the primary reason. So it is also kind of like the basis of effects animation, which is again different from your character animation because it relies a lot on different types of effects animation, like let's say water, particle simulation, fire. These different transitions would actually help make your effects animation a bit more convincing. And usually you would not see this in animation software. You would see this more in terms of video editors like After Effects, Premiere, Vegas, and so on and so forth. Here we have our different examples. So logo animations, Marvel Studios, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, all of those logos that come into the screen before a movie is an example of a logo animation. We also have transition animations and explainer videos. So they have this kind of like cut out feel, basic shape kind of feel, which is not really meant for you to be entertained or to be appealing. It's just meant to kind of grab your attention through these really good visuals and then allow you to be informed or allow you to be given this commercial. That's essentially the main purposes of this one. The last part isn't really an example of a type of animation, but it is something that you see currently in as a trend in animation, which is hybrid animation. So you don't really see a lot of animations nowadays that is purely just like, let's say, traditional or just purely like 2D. So hybrid is essentially utilizing multiple types of animation towards different parts of the animation. So you would see different types of animation only within one scene. So the main purpose of this one is for you to be able to maximize the uniqueness and quality of each animation type and also to increase efficiency. So you can see this a lot, particularly like let's say if your character is done through traditional animation, you might have a background that is done 3D. So in terms of a stylistic choice, that is again more or less a decision or more or less the work of the art director and the animation director. But in terms of an animation production standpoint, it is a bit more efficient for you to have a 3D model and then just have the camera angles that you need compared to like let's say painting a background over and over again with just a few seconds of exposure. So with this one, I'll be showing you a clip of an episode of the anime Demon Slayer because a lot of a lot of these hybrid animations are mostly seen through Japanese animation. And I'll be showing you one of the iconic scenes from episode 19. So with this one, let this be your spoiler warning. There's also a lot of violence for this one, so trigger warning. And after the first viewing, I will be explaining how different types of animation make this scene so iconic and how they're able to work together to create such a masterpiece of an animation. Okay, so let's start off first with this effects animation right here. So even like let's say at the very beginning right here, yung the breath thing that happens or the breathing technique that happens. So this one is an example of effects animation. This is usually done through digital animation. It can either be 2D animation, 3D animation, or more effectively more effectively motion graphics. And an extension of that motion graphics is also seen right here in this effect animation. So this effect or any type of effect animation that you see in this screen is mostly used through a combination of stop motion as well as paperless animation. So stop motion is used at its base. So all of those particle simulations, all of those movements that are done for this one, the movement of the water, the movement of the fire, all of those are done through the use of effects animation, or rather motion graphics. And it is reinforced with paperless animation. So the paperless animation makes it look 2D because most of these things are usually looking a bit more 3D. So it so that it kind of looks in the same universe as the character who uses it, which is usually done in traditional animation, there is a necessity for you to kind of make it a bit 2D, and that's where paperless animation comes in. You can very much see it towards the lines right here. So if you're going to slow this down very frame by frame, and analyze them, these lines aren't really at the same thickness and they're not usually consistent. And it's not really a bad thing in this case because this is an example of an effects animation and you don't really want your fire cleanup to be very consistent and very thick. And I think that's a really good design choice from the art director and animation director. You can also see it within the particle simulation, which is seen right here. So all of those ones are done through stop motion and paperless animation, or rather motion graphics and paperless animation. Okay, now let's move on right here. Anytime that you see a character do an extreme pose that you can see the face, and usually it's a full body, and it's almost something that you would see on the screen, something like this. This is an example of traditional animation. So you can do this in 3D by theory, but it doesn't really look right. A lot of the fight scenes that you see in Japanese animation, or a lot of the really good fight scenes that you see in animation rather, is done through traditional animation. Because if you do this in 3D animation, it would look a little bit more flowy, which is not really something that we're looking for a fight scene. We need explosiveness, we need vigor, we need vitality, and that's what traditional animation provides us. So one of the things right here is that you can clearly see the background. So for the background, if you have not noticed it already, it is in 3D. So the importance of it being 3D will be shown to you later. But as of now, you can see that the background is 3D. These lines are of course created through the use of motion graphics, and we have your character right here. So this character can either be created through 3D or traditional. Most likely, this character is created through 3D, and you would see that for a lot of reasons. So it's quite far away, so that can be a condition. If you do not see the character, if you do not see the character's face, that is most likely 3D, and you see it a lot in this anime actually. If you see a character walking and you don't really see their face, that's an example of a 3D animated model. So it makes it a little bit easier for the animation team because they don't really have to go and get, or they don't really have to redraw anything again. They just have to use that one in their library, and it wouldn't really even be noticed because you won't really actually see the face. So that is another way for you to make your animation more efficient. So now let's proceed. Okay. So for this one, anytime that you see the character which is a bit more, yeah, you can see it more towards the screen, it's mostly an example of traditional animation. But in this case, it has also included parts of paperless animation. So let's try and speed it up a little bit more. Okay, I guess you can see it a bit more now. So for this shot, you can see a combination of traditional animation and paperless animation. The base being traditional animation in terms of how it moves and as well as its cleanup, and then the cleanup is further reinforced with paperless animation. So you can very much see that it's traditional animation because of how consistent the line is. Also, the lines tend to look a little bit more porous, which is a little bit more visible towards the right side of the neck right here where the start of the collar is. So this line is not really that clean. It's not very dark. You can also see parts of it that are a little bit more porous. You can see it in the hair. You can see it on the clothes right here. Anytime that it hits the light, that is the time that you would most likely see it. So we also have right here your paperless animation around the left side right here, where you can see it in the face as well as the hair right here. So the importance of having paperless animation is also quite important when you're doing 3D animation. Because if you have a 3D background, especially a light 3D background, and you have only strictly traditional animation, it might not look good. Tendency is that the character would be washed out of and would usually blend into the background, which is something that you don't really want to happen. You would like the character be the focal point and then the background be the background. And if you're going to have a very porous type of cleanup that is against a light background, it's really going to eat away at it. You can even see portions of it right here around the haori, around the jawline, which is not really noticeable because it's color black, but it is a little bit visible if you try to zoom in. Another thing that is noticed right here is that this paperless animation right here is more of a stylistic choice. So if you would like to differentiate kind of like the face, that would be a bit better for you to add a darker line. So you can see it right here. You can also see it on the hair. But predominantly, this is traditional animation. One more thing, when it comes to Japanese animation, they don't really color their characters through acrylic paint and through cell animation. They would usually scan the papered, the clean up pencil animation, which is on paper, and then they would use the fill bucket tool or paint bucket tool for them to be able to fill in the colors, which is also seen right here. When you might also see it in these cases. So you have the blood that's trickling down the face, so you might see that it's actually quite inconsistent with the face. So that the reason for that one is because the color of the clean up right here is actually colored red, which is in line with the blood right here. So that is more of a coloring type of thing. It might have shown a little bit more error. There wasn't really a lot of care taken around here, but it's something that's minor and it doesn't really take away from the beauty of the sequence. So let's proceed. This next point is we have here a character or the main character, which is slowed down. So this main character, even though you don't really see the face, this is a combination of 3D animation, traditional animation, paperless animation, and of course, motion graphics right here. So the motion graphics, of course, comes from the effects animation that's coming right here, and of course, the paperless animation for the lines. For this one, they used 3D animation in terms of the model. So one thing that they could have done right here is something called rotoscoping. So rotoscoping is the idea of you taking a video and then tracing portions of that video and then modifying a little bit so that you would be able to get movements, difficult movements like these ones, a little bit more accurately compared to just imagining it and doing it yourself. So having a really good reference for these types of difficult actions is much better for you to do as an animator. For this one, if you were to do this for a video animation, it doesn't really look that convincing. Number one is because the proportions of the characters that we have right here are a little bit more similar to that of children. And the proportions in terms of muscle composition is a lot more compared to that of a child. So with that one, you can't really find a person out on the street with those types of proportions. So it would be easier for you to just have a 3D model. And then of course the translation, so the time for you to be able to take a video and then um, transfer it to a computer wherein you're going to do the traditional animation, that's a little bit more difficult compared to just having the 3D model instead. So you already have the 3D model, might as well use it. Another thing is that when it comes to these extreme foreshortening poses, it looks a little bit too much compared to that of what is actually supposedly a foreshortening type of pose. So the leg right here is a little bit more exaggerated. So if you were to make this, or if you were to place this at an isometric perspective, or rather an orthographic perspective, the proportions might not look the same. So for you to be able to do that, you might have a 3D model and exaggerate places here and there to kind of aid with your traditional animation. And then afterwards, it has been modified a little bit and fit to traditional animation, which you can see right here in the cleanup. So it's not entirely a dark line, and then a little bit of paperless animation probably around the left side right here. So this is something that you can't really get with just 3D animation. So this change of perspective, change of foreshortening, that is really excellently done through the use mainly of traditional animation. So 3D plays a really important role for this one, but really the traditional animation, the timing of it, the modification of the timing that is provided by the traditional animation actually makes it. So around the next points right here, you will be seeing, anytime that you see a screenshot like this, or you just have a stagnant character like this is usually traditional animation, especially if you can see the face. Of course, the threads right here are more of motion graphics or just 3D animation. Okay, and then the next portion is we'll be having a really extreme action sequence. So for this one, this is created through, of course, your traditional animation for the character. But what I really want you to focus on is the background, because the background really moves a lot more compared to that of the character. And this is something that you see a lot in terms of animation. It kind of gives you the idea that the character is really moving this extremely, when in reality you're mostly doing a little bit more shots. So in terms of, if you're not really experienced in animation, you would really think that the animators did a lot of work. They did, however, they made probably a little bit less work than you might have realized. So it's a little bit of an illusion, so to speak. Moving the background, which is a lot easier to move, is actually better instead of you just moving the character. So there is still a lot of movement towards the character, but they are mostly using it. They're kind of like having these types of cheats, having these smears, making it a little bit easier for us to be able to make sure. It's a little bit easier for them to be able to animate compared to just having a stagnant background and making the character move in that stagnant background. So this makes it a little bit more dynamic, a lot more it gives a lot more vigor, a lot more vitality, with less work than you might have expected. So of course, this shot is done through traditional plus paperless animation. You can see it through the thicker lines right here. And this is usually added at in post. So whenever you see any type of effects animation, that is usually done through compositing, and it's usually done through either 3D animation or motion graphics animation. So with that one, let's just proceed with the rest of this sequence right here. Okay, let's pause at the mom right here. So this is another example of paperless animation and traditional animation. Of course, the traditional animation is the very basis right here. You can see it in the cleanup. So the cleanup for the cloth that hangs around her face, you can see it right here. You can see it more or less around the details of the eyes, and then you can see it around the tip of the nose. Whereas you can also see a lot of darker lines. So the forehead right here, the nose bridge, the clothing over here. Anytime that you would see a darker line, it would make it more for traditional, rather paperless animation. Another thing that would be a reason for this paperless animation, aside from making the lines thicker, is for you to be able to kind of save time. So there are instances wherein you would have the same face, but have, like, let's say, different distances from the camera. So if you would just like to have the camera a bit farther away, then you might want to use traditional animation. If your character is a bit closer, then you might want to add thicker lines. So that's for paperless animation. Another thing is that it's a little bit more stylistic choice in this case, because you can't really properly determine where they're placing their thicker lines. It makes it a little bit more dynamic, whereas just having a flat line that is done by pencil, it isn't really that appealing in terms of focusing, especially for a tight, extreme close-up shot like this. So those are just some things that you might be able to do. On this next shot right here, you can also see that the thickness of the lines have actually differed. So you can see it right here in the face. You can also kind of like see it in the clothing right here. So the cloth that kind of covers her face, that is thinner on the previous frame, whereas for this one, it's now a bit thicker. So you can't really predict that one. Another thing is that for the face right here, the lines are a bit thinner compared to that of the previous shot, which kind of also showcases how having different distances from the camera could affect the thickness of the lines. And that is something that you can do a bit easier for paperless animation compared to that of traditional animation. So with that one, yeah, these are just some things that you might be able to look out for when you are watching these types of Japanese animations. the integration of these different types of animation. One more thing that I would like to emphasize right here, there's a lot of particle animation, a lot of particle simulation right here. This can be done through the use of motion graphics or 3D animation. So particle simulation is essentially allowing your computer to generate different types of particles. So that would be the sparks that you can see right here. So these ones are not really done by hand. There's no specific time chart for that one. They are usually added in post, and it really helps when it comes to creating these effects and making them a lot easier. So as I was saying a while ago, having these different types of animations can actually create a really iconic scene like this. And it's really important for us as animators not to be purists or not to be stuck only with one type of animation, because there are those types of people that would just have a specific type of animation in mind, which is something that's not wise to do. So understanding how these different types of animations would bring out, or what are their different advantages are, and how you're going to bring them out together actually would help you create really masterpieces of animation. So the next portion is we'll now be talking about paperless animation by itself, which is actually our main focus. So paperless animation, as we've stated a while ago, is considered as a mix of traditional and digital animation. So all of the steps that are done in the animation production that has been done previously traditionally is now done through a computer, as well as computer tools like your drawing tablet or your mouse. So particularly, the steps for keyframing, in-betweening, line testing, cleanup, and coloring, those are now done digitally. However, it still utilizes the same concepts, principles, and techniques that are seen in traditional animation. Here we have a few advantages and one disadvantage of paperless animation. So the main advantage really of paperless animation is for you to be able to get that flexibility and exaggeration of characters and effects that are only possible through the use of traditional animation. So there's a reason why traditional animation is still something that's prominent within our animation industry, even though we have all of these advances in 2D animation, 3D animation, motion graphics, and so on and so forth. So essentially, traditional animation has kind of like this certain type of appeal, or is something that's really not replicated by 2D and 3D animation, wherein you're able to do a lot of freedom when it comes to the design of the character. So particularly more of that flexibility and exaggeration, like your squash, stretch, exaggeration. You're able to like have these smears that are not really possible for 2D or 3D animation. And that actually makes your animation, even though that it's something that's out of reality, it makes it a little bit more interesting, or rather it gives a little bit more vigor and vitality to your animation. And with that one, that's why traditional animation is still very much appealing and the basis of all of these different types of animation. So with that one, having not having this one for your paperless animation can make it seem that your final output would look quite robotic. So having these types of flexibility and exaggeration would help you create a lot more different types of actions that might not be necessary for the other types of animations. And now you can do it through digital means by your computer and your drawing tablet or mouse, and you're able to do them with lesser resources and with better efficiency. So now let's focus on lesser resources. So in terms of resources, of course, your paper use is considerably cut down. Virtually speaking, you are able to use zero paper for paperless animation, and thus production is cheaper. So if you are a startup animator, this might be the best type of animation for you. It is also more efficient in terms of the line testing phase. So for traditional animation, if you're comparing it to that, um, you have a specific type of step just for line testing. So with that one, that's another thing that might consume a lot more of your time. And the idea of line testing is actually something that you would have to do separately. Whereas for paperless animation, line testing is already integrated in the animation software. So you don't have to create some unnecessary steps for you to be able to create different types of line testing. So it's much easier for you to be able to do line testing, and In that regard, your quality would also increase since you have a lot more opportunities to check your own work. Next one, more efficient. Another person is able to undo, copy, and paste portions of the drawing, which will make it so that your drawing time is cut into significant portions. So, for example, you would like to do separation. Instead of you tracing every single portion of the non-moving objects, all you really have to do is for you to be able to have one layer for the non-moving objects and then another layer for the moving objects. The non-moving layer is only drawn once, which is a lot more efficient depending on how many frames you have for the moving objects. You can also undo things. So if you have any mistakes from your cleanup, you're able to simply undo, or you would have a better job of erasing them compared to doing it traditionally. In terms of future use, you can also create a library or an archive for you to be able to use them in the future. So like let's say you have created a walk cycle. If you save that in a library or an archive, by the time you need another type of walk cycle or another walk cycle for another sequence, it would just be easy for you to pull it out from your library and reuse it again. If you need to resize it, it would be much better for you to do that and then just add modifications in terms of cleanup. Another thing is that it's more efficient when it comes to rotoscoping. So you'll be eliminating the need for you to print if in case you would like to use rotoscoping. The main disadvantage that I see for paperless animation is comparing it to 2D or 3D animation, it can still take a lot more time. In some cases, it might even be longer compared to that of stop motion animation. Another thing that is not really placed right here, but it's more of an inference, is that in terms of the common applications, you'd mostly see it in smaller studio animations or independent animations. So if you are a YouTuber, more or less you tend to see more paperless animations. If you're a small studio where you're not really able or you can't really afford to buy paper every single time, then you would use paperless animation. Another thing for Japanese animation is that it is something that's used. However, it's not the tool of choice or it's not the type of animation of choice. If they can, even if small studio animations can, they would choose traditional animation over paperless animation. The reasons for that one are a little bit more unknown or it's a little bit vague for me. So with that one, you might be able to find the reason and it's just something for you to ponder as to why paperless animation is something that's not really used in the industry, despite all of the advantages that were listed above. So, something to think about. Next one is the workflow for paperless animation. So, I'll try to make this a little bit quick, but I'll just like to emphasize the difference between a paperless animation workflow and a traditional animation workflow. In terms of pre-production, it's virtually the same. There's nothing that you have to change, probably except some of the medium. So like let's say in terms of design and animatic and storyboard, it is possible for you to do that now digitally. Production, in terms of that one, there are some things that are similar or very much similar to that of the the traditional animation workflow, but there are some changes. Particularly, your line up, um, your line testing phase has been removed and has been fused together toward the other parts of the animation production workflow. And also, we have a change of materials and equipment. And with that extent, some changes in technique might be created. So let's look into some of them. So for the exposure sheet, it's mostly exactly the same. The only thing that you might be able to do is to transcribe a digital copy. Next one for keyframing, it's exactly the same thing. You would need to have your special instructions, your exposure sheet, your timing chart. You would have to still submit it to a cleanup artist afterwards if necessary. Um, if you need changes, then the changes would also be reflected quite similarly, except now it is done at a digital type of output. So in terms of the record keeping procedures and the submission procedures, it might be a little bit different. One of which is that you would be saving the animation software. I mean, you'll be saving your activity in terms of a format of an animation software, and then you'll be sending it either through flash drive or email, or more importantly, a local area network. So a local area network, particularly if you are in-house, which means that you are working inside the animation studio, is that your computers are essentially connected with one another. So without even internet connection, you're able to send these different types of files that you have created towards your supervisors. Next one for line testing. Line testing is essentially integrated already in the steps of keyframing, in-betweening, cleanup, and even coloring. Most importantly, you would see this more in terms of in-betweening, obviously. So this is done mostly as part of the animation software. So it's still an important step, but it's not that let's say it's not that time consuming for it to have a separate step. And of course, as I've stated a while ago, it is much easier and it would give a lot more quality to your animation because it is something that you can do almost instantly. So your checking would be a lot more often. And with that one, the quality by theory would go a bit higher. If you would need to have a separate line testing process for the animation director, all you have to do is for you to submit the works of or the files of the animators and then view it yourself as an animation or art director. Next one for in-betweening. For in-betweening, this is something that is quite similar as well to that of keyframing, wherein there's not really a lot of changes except for the submission and record-keeping procedures. Also, you would have to do a lot more line testing, or you are able to do a lot more line testing because it is already imbued in the animation software. For cleanup, this might have a lot more changes as together with that one of your coloring. In terms of the steps or the do's and don'ts, it's more or less essentially the same thing. However, the technique might be different. So for one, you have two types of techniques. You have your pen tool and then you have your freehand. So based on what you're supposed to use, your materials and equipment, this would be dictated for you. And the skill set that you need for a pen tool might be different to that of a freehand. Another thing is that when it comes to how you're supposed to do it, it's a little bit different. Like, let's say, for a cleanup in terms of traditional animation, it's better for you to go a bit slower, for you to have more consistency in terms of your lines. But if you would like consistency in your lines for paperless animation or digital cleanup, it is much better for you to draw your lines a bit faster. And then, of course, for traditional animation, erasers are a no-go. Whereas for digital animation, it's very much easier for you to just undo and do it again. And it makes it a little bit easier to some extent, but that would again depend on the skill of the cleanup artist. Next one is we have coloring. Coloring is essentially adding base colors, shadows, highlights for the final frames. And usually a color artist would have the final cleanup lines from the cleanup artist, and they won't really do, like, let's say, coloring per se. It's just more of filling in a color using your paint bucket tool. So this is more of, like, I'm not so sure what you're supposed to call it, cell shading or block shading. So it's more of just having a solid color instead of blending the colors together. If you would need to do highlighting or shadowing, that would mostly be also a solid color. However, there are also some ways on how you can do coloring aside from paint bucket. We also have a gradient tool wherein you have a shift between two colors. This is not really commonly used because it is also important for the colorist to also match the grade or how wide the gradient is. So with that one, it doesn't really move up and down within the animation or within the animation itself. We also have texturing, so adding textures to the character, usually clothing. And there are two ways where this can happen. Usually the texture would stay in place. So like, let's say when the texture would move in the cloth, when the character raises their hand, the texture would follow. Or in some cases, it would also move with the character. So it stays in place, but even though the character moves, the texture also kind of moves. So if you're going to think about it, it's more of like the texture is placed on the frame itself. And then for you to kind of create that texture, you're just going to create a cutout in the color. And then there you have the texture already. So one good example of this one is, I think, Chowder, which is a current Cartoon Network show beforehand. Another thing for coloring is that it actually goes back to cleanup, which is something that I forgot. When you're doing cleanup for paperless animation, you can also do a style of cleanup wherein you'll be using different colors. So like let's say if you have a shadow, you have to use a blue line instead of a black line. If you're going to do a highlight, you might well as use a yellow line for you to indicate that it's a highlight. So with that one, when the colorist is going to do the highlighting and the shadowing, it would be easier for them to determine as well. And for you to be able to blend the shadowing and highlighting towards the character, you don't really want a black line for the shadow. So what would happen is that they would use another color and then change that color later on in the coloring process for it to kind of match with the color of the shadow or the highlight. Next one is for compositing. It's quite similar to that of traditional animation. So essentially, you will be going in a video editor, assembling all of the elements, adding camera movements, adding digital effects and filters. If you would need to overexpose something, like let's say if you would like to have a lighter light or a more neon light, you might want to do overexposure for that one. And then the last one is we have export and render. So for exporting and render, it's essentially the same thing, but there are some key differences. Number one, the compositor is also usually the person who will be doing the rendering as well. And number two is that one device would be used for all of the rendering, so it's not like multiple devices stacked together for you to be able to create the rendering process. And then after the rendering process, that can be your final output. We also have here your post-production, which is essentially the same thing as that with your traditional animation. Next one, we have here materials and equipment for paperless animation. So we have some changes, or a lot of changes rather. So instead of using your pencil and your paper and your light box, you'll be using a computer, animation software, drawing tablet, mouse, stylus, or finger. So for your computer, this is more in terms of the industry, but if you have your smartphone or your laptop or your desktop, those are fine. There's technically no differences, or we would like to make sure that there are no differences if you have a smartphone or a desktop. So the quality of your activity would mostly come from your skill and not necessarily the device that you would use. But having a really good device, of course, would really help. Next one, we have your animation software. Similar thing. We would really like to make sure that the animation software that you're using is not the reason why you cannot have a good output. There are some instances wherein that would happen, but as much as possible, we would like to minimize that, wherein the skill is the primary concern for the differences in outputs. But if you can have these characteristics, it would be a lot better. However, in terms of the industry as well, when you have an animation software, usually an animation company would not have just one software. They would have multiple according to its uses. So a software can have all of the uses, but it can also have specific uses. So for example, animation studios can have a video editor specifically for compositing. We also have software that would just focus mostly on modeling and 3D. We also have computers for coloring. So as a colorist or a color artist, usually you won't really need the animation tools that is necessary for keyframing, cleanup, and in between. So since you're just doing a fill bucket tool, and if the animation is done right, technically speaking, you don't really have to have the animation tools previously needed. We also have computers for just compositing, again, video editors usually. And then we also have computers with the latest software just for rendering. This is seen in, I believe, Toon City Academy, which is one of our key partners beforehand, before this entire pandemic thing happened. So what they would do, according to one of their directors, is that they would have TV Paint, which is one of the animation softwares. So majority of their computers would have the lesser version of TV Paint. I think what they said was that it was version 3, whereas the latest version is, I think, 11 or 12. Whereas there are, I believe, 3 computers that would have the latest version, so either 11 or 12, and then they would use those 3 computers for just compositing and for rendering. But for the actual animation process, keyframing, cleanup in betweening, coloring, they would use the TV paints with the lower versions because essentially they're kind of the same. They would use the later versions for, of course, the compositing capabilities, and if they would like to add more effects, if they would have a better a better render, then they would use the later version. But essentially, if you're going to do it at a lower version and it's not yet final, it's okay for you to use the the earlier versions. So it's a way for you to kind of save money as an animation studio. We also have here a drawing tablet. For those who have drawing tablets, again, it would be better for you, but you can use mouse, you can use your finger, you can use a stylus for you to be able to do the activities that are necessary for this subject. Other things that you might want to have is a video editing software, but not really necessary. We also have traditional drawing or animation materials and equipment. So the main purpose for this one is really more to aid you in terms of your animation workflow or more of the pre-production process. So for example, if you're the type of person who would like to render using traditional animation, or you would like to render it using your pencil, then it's possible for you to do that and then bring it back up digitally to do the cleanup. This is something that you can do. We also have camera for rotoscoping. If you would need to, again, take a photo of it for the rendering process, you might want to use a camera or a scanner. And the local area network is really more for the industry. So the next portion that I'll be talking about is the drawing tablet. So again, this is not really something that is necessary for our activity, but it is something that you might want to look into since the focus of this subject is digital animation. So if ever you go towards the industry, you might be encountering the drawing tablet. So it's quite necessary for you to have at least an inkling of what it's supposed to be. So your drawing tablet is usually the main way on how we would do digital or paperless animation. You can do almost anything with it. You can use it for keyframing, in-betweening, clean up, coloring, even compositing. You can even use it to create 3D models. We have a specific type of tablet just for the ZBrush, which is specifically for 3D modeling and all of those different things. But now we'll be looking into some portions of it. So we have our parts, our types, other things, other important parts, setting it up, also some things that you might need to know when you're using a drawing tablet. So the first one is the parts. So we have usually, first of all, a graphics tablet. So this is the actual tablet itself. Usually for a lot of our tablets, they would come in with this. So this is essentially the main drawing tablet itself. This is where you're going to draw. This is one half of the main thing that you're supposed to have. In your graphics tablet, you have a drawing area. So the entire tablet itself, there is usually a specific area where you're only allowed to draw. This would depend model by model, brand by brand, but it would usually be, particularly for Wacom tablets, they have like this dotted area, that's your drawing area. The other parts would usually be where your components are, where your buttons would be, where you would place your pen, and so on and so forth. We also have shortcut buttons and express keys. So again, this would depend model by model. But essentially, these are buttons, external buttons within the graphics tablet for you to customize and input keyboard shortcuts. If in case you're doing a lot of different things, it would be easier for you to just click on that button instead of doing the actual keyboard shortcuts on the keyboard. So it would get really complicated depending on the complexity of the tablet. There would be some instances as well that it would have a separate remote, particularly for those Wacom Cintiq models. So they have a separate remote that would have a lot more express keys. One half of the really important part of your drawing tablet is your stylus, also known as your drawing pen. So it very much looks like an actual pen. Of course, it doesn't really have any ink to it. There are usually buttons at the side of it so that you can customize them and then add specific gestures. So like, let's say if you would like to increase the brush size or if you would like to do undo quickly, you can use this part right here. Under your stylus, you have something which we call as a pen nib. So these are the replaceable pen tips, and this is usually the one that gets exhausted the fastest. So you might be able to change them depending on how much you are drawing, around a year, 6 months. It really depends on how much you're able to draw. And the main purpose of your pen nib is really to help facilitate that feel of a pen, particularly pen pressure and sensitivity. So it detects that one. Different pen nibs can also be created through the use of different materials for different uses and feels. So for example, like let's say if you would like to do a little bit more calligraphy, you might want to focus more on a stroke type of pen nib. If you're more into coloring or if you want a little bit more texture, then you might want to do a felt tip. So it would depend on your needs. but usually we have a standard one, which is made of really flexible plastic. We also have a tablet driver. So this would again depend from model to model. I believe for XP Pen, the Deco series, they don't really need a tablet, so it's just plug and play. For Wacom devices, Huon devices, they need to have a tablet driver, which is usually in the form of a CD, or it's something that you can install online. Other things, you might want to have a USB cord. That is the main way on how you can connect your graphics tablet to your computer. You also have a Bluetooth receiver or internal battery if you would like to have your tablet as something that's wireless. Here we have different types of drawing tablets, so I would just like to focus on some of them. The other ones are more or less something that you don't really use for digital or paperless animation. The one that we currently or mostly use is something which we call as passive tablets. So passive tablets, their main source of power is really the drawing tablet itself or the drawing area. The pen doesn't really have any electrical power in them. They would be used mostly, the drawing tablet would mostly be sensing the pen instead, but technically speaking, the pen doesn't really have anything that is electrical inside of it. So in terms of drawing capabilities, for your drawing or for your stylus without electricity, it would be much more long lasting for you as a user since it doesn't really heat up. So you don't have like any strains for carpal tunnel or any types of injuries that might be caused by an overheating pen. This is also for general use. Another thing pala, for the stylus, in olden times, so by around the 2000s, if you had a passive tablet, it's not as accurate compared to that of an active tablet. So, however, with the technology that we have, with the developments by Wacom and these other drawing tablets, that's not really a problem anymore in terms of its pressure sensitivity and jitter. If you have a passive tablet, it could be just as powerful as an active tablet. So a lot of the brands that you see out there, particularly Wacom, Huon, XP Pen, most of those ones are passive tablets. We also have active tablets, so they quite look the same as that of a passive tablet, but the main difference right there is that the pen has power. So if a pen has power, of course that might tend to overheat. That can also result to a bulkier status. But the main thing that it can do is that it would result to less jitter. So jitter is essentially the signal or the consistency of the signal from the pen to the drawing tablet. So if there's no consistent signal, usually the lines would be a bit bumpy. So we'll be seeing that a little bit later. And you don't really want that in most of your cases. So having an active tablet can actively prevent that. So we don't really see a lot of these ones. There might be some smaller brand tablets that would be an example of an active tablet, but a lot of the bigger branded tablets or drawing tablets would have more of a passive type of thing. We also have these other things, acoustic tablets, which is really focused more on creating sounds, optical tablets that have a digital camera, capacitive tablets, which focus on electronic signals. So if you would like to sign something, that is usually a capacitive tablet. Okay, now let's move on to embedded LCD tablets. So for passive and active tablets, you can see right here that you don't have a way for you to see your final output in the tablet. Usually you would have to look at the screen and not look at your tablet while you're drawing. So that is one of the main things that you really have to focus on when you are a first-time beginner. If you have a little bit more money or if your company has a little bit more money, then tendency is that they would have these embedded LCD tablets. So in terms of your use, it is something that you can see immediately on your screen. So it's very much similar like drawing on paper. So you can draw directly on the surface. You can see your results much quicker compared to that of a passive or an active tablet. So these are your Cintiqs, your Canvas series. This is the Wacom one, which is I think the lowest level type of LCD tablet out there. We also have a standalone drawing tablet. So a standalone drawing tablet is kind of like this all-in-one tablet wherein it has its own operating system, but its main use really is for you to be able to draw. So you have your mobile studio, your Canvas studio, you also have your iPad. That's also an example of a standalone drawing tablet. So those are just your different types. Usually you would see a passive tablet or an embedded LCD tablet within the animation industry. So those are the main things that you would be able to use. Mostly for beginners, you would have a passive or an active tablet. So that barrier of you looking at your screen and not looking at the place where you are drawing or where you're animating is something as a skill for you to learn as an animator. So if we didn't really have this pandemic, you would have had the time to do that, but unfortunately, things happen. We can't really do a lot about it. Let's go back to this one, and here we have some other important concepts in using the drawing tablet. So we have three things. So these three things are more of like settings when you're using your drawing tablet. We have pressure sensitivity, jitter, and smoothing and stabilization. So this is more of the drawing tablet. It can also be affected by the software that you're using. So pressure sensitivity and jitter is something that is more of a drawing tablet kind of situation, whereas for the smoothing and stabilization, that's more of the animation software or the drawing software. So we have here pressure sensitivity. So pressure sensitivity is more on how much your pen would reflect how much pressure you're placing on a pen. So this is usually measured in levels. The lowest one that I've seen in current tablets is more of 1024 levels. The standard is usually 2048 or 4096. In animation studios, you might have 4096 or 8192 levels. But essentially, these levels is more of like the amount of differences that you would see in terms of the difference in pressure sensitivity. So it kind of looks like this. So if you have a lighter stroke, then it would look lighter. If it's darker, then it would be a lot thicker. Next one is jitter. Jitter focuses more on the variation of how often a signal is being generated. So if you have more of these dotted lines right here, that would mean that you have a slow jitter. That would mean that the communication between your drawing tablet and your stylus to that of your animation software is a little bit weaker. So probably that might be a drawing tablet kind of situation, or in some cases it can also be affected by your animation software or your device. So if your device is a bit slower when it comes to translating those different strokes that you are creating, that can be again something that would affect the jitter of your output. Lastly, we have smoothing and stabilizing. So this is more for the animation software or the drawing software. So this is a setting wherein the software will automatically smoothen the line that is drawn in real time. So what would happen right here is a little bit of artificial intelligence, so to speak. So what would happen is that it would make it so that it's a bit more appealing. So if you don't have a stabilizer, it would just reflect it as it is. But if you have a stabilizer, it would look quote unquote a little bit more appealing. So if you have pressure sensitivity, it would reflect the pressure sensitivity that you might like to have. If you are drawing a circle, tendency is that it would create it into a perfect circle. So your Procreate has a lot of these features wherein you're just going to draw a circle and then automatically it can create it into a perfect circle as a more extreme example. But for a lot of our drawing or animation software, it's a little bit more subtle. So it kind of looks like this. In terms of setting up, I won't really be focusing so much on this one, but one thing that I really would like to focus on is this photo right here. So when you're using your tablet for the first time, there are a lot of people that would have it within every other place. So they would have it slightly towards the left of their monitor, slightly towards the right, at an angle, which is not really something that you would like to do. Um, for some of your tablets, there are some instances wherein there's a left side and a right side, and that would depend on the positioning of the button right here. So for example, the one in the photo right here, it is a right-handed type of tablet. So if you would like to turn it into something that's left-handed, you have to turn these buttons right here to the right side so that it doesn't collide with your hand. There are also some tablets that doesn't really matter, like let's say your Wacom Intuos. Um, it is also really important for your tablet, if you're a first-time beginner, to have it squarely in front of your monitor. Because usually, the space in your tablet usually reflects the entire size of your monitor. So if you were to place your pen at the very bottom right side, it would also place it towards the bottom right side. Unlike your mouse, wherein, like, let's say you're able to kind of drag it out and it would continue. For a drawing tablet, it would pinpoint according to the position of the stylus to the drawing area. So having it squarely in front of you, in front of the monitor rather, would make it easier for you to acclimate. Another thing is for you to be able to calibrate your tablet properties. So for this one, you might need to install it if you're using a Wacom or a Q1 tablet or any other type of tablet. For some models for XP Pen, you don't really need to, so this will automatically come out. So for this one, you can kind of change your express keys over here. That would depend on the application. It can also be something that you can do overall. You can also change your pen. So if you're someone who doesn't really look so much into, or if you're not really that reactive, then probably you might be able to have a softer pressure. The tip feel is also something that you might want to change. You can also change the shortcut keys within your pen right here. And then here we also have, lastly, tips and techniques for using the drawing tablet. Number one is, again, high hand and eye coordination. This is something that is currently that we have to consider when we are looking at a drawing tablet, particularly a passive or an active drawing tablet. If you're a first-time user and you've just been using it for traditional drawing, or if you're just someone who doesn't really do a lot of digital animation, this is a learning curve that you have to overcome. So the thing right here is that when you're using a drawing tablet, you're not supposed to look at the drawing tablet. You're supposed to look at the monitor. This is something that's quite hard to do, and there's really not a runaround over it. But think of it more as kind of like your mouse. So your mouse is something that you don't really look at your hand when you're using the mouse. You just look at the monitor. That's essentially the same thing for a drawing tablet. The thing that I would suggest for you to do, for you to be able to make sure that your tablet is something that you can acclimate to a lot easier, is for you to use it as a mouse. So if you use it quite similarly as a mouse, then it might help you acclimate a lot more. It would help you get familiarized with the environment before you start drawing. So that might be something that you might want to do if you are a first time drawing tablet user. It is also okay for you to place your hand on your tablet, but please make sure if you have a touch feature, like for a Cintiq or a Wacom Intuos, there might be a touch feature. Please turn it off. Also, please practice your hand and wrist drawing techniques. Really important. Your drawing tablets can get a bit hotter. So if you would like to prevent carpal tunnel, please make sure to always take a lot of breaks, because if your hand is always at a hot surface, you can get carpal tunnel syndrome and any other type of exhaustive muscle syndrome. So there was this one story from, again, one of the directors from Toon City Academy, wherein it's really important for you to have gloves. So for those who have purchased drawing tablets beforehand, you might have these types of gloves that would cover your pinky finger and your ring finger. So for those ones, those are quite important to also protect your hand. Because if you don't do that, according to that director, they might have permanent hand damage. And that would really affect not only your drawing or your animation, but also everything that you would do. Next one, this is our last portion. We have the animation software, particularly that of Krita. So Krita is something that you might be already familiar with, particularly that of our Module 7 from the previous trimester. But we'll just like to emphasize some of the things right here. First one is the default workspace and interface. So this is something that has been discussed already from your Module 7. One thing that you might want to focus on is more on the Dockers. So the Dockers, as we've stated beforehand, it is something that you can move. So you can kind of make this a bit smaller. You can remove this. You can add a lot more. You can move it anywhere within your screen if you would like to. But this is kind of like a double-edged sword. So you can customize it as much as you would like. Personally, for me, I kind of mimic it quite similarly to that of Photoshop, or even you can kind of mimic it similar to that of Photoshop, but it doesn't really fit on my screen. So there might be a little bit of adjustment that you have to undergo with. When you're starting a new file, you have to use file and new file, and then you can change the dimensions, you can use templates, you can change a lot of things like, let's say, background, color, number of layers, number of frames that you can use already, then click create. Now we'll be looking into more of the types of dockers that we have. First one is the toolbox. So the toolbox is essentially the main things that you can do in Krita as an animation software and as a drawing software. So for this one, you can add text, you have your brushes, you have your moving tools, you have your shape tools, you have your adjustment tools, like let's say the eyedropper, and all of those different things. So you would usually see them at the leftmost side of um, the software when you first open it. We also have our tool options, which is usually placed at the upper right side. So this one is a more specific type of details or options for your toolbox. So if you have selected your brush tool, there are specific details that you have for that one. This one is more of a move tool, so it would help you specify a lot more details when you're moving an object. Specifically, let's look into default brushes and settings. So for Krita, there's actually a lot of brushes. You can even download a lot of them online. It's easier for you to install them since Krita is free. And you can also change them a lot more once you go towards the edit brush settings. We also have your eraser, but technically you don't necessarily need this. All you really have to do is to press E or to press the eraser option when you are using your brush tool, and then you can use it as an eraser. But if you would like a more precise eraser, like let's say a kneaded type of eraser, you can use this part right here. We also have a lot of keyboard shortcuts. There are predefined shortcuts in Krita, but there are also a lot of things that you can modify. So if you're a person who are more into Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Suite shortcuts, then this is something that you can change yourself. We also have our layers. So this is something that has been explained beforehand, but using your layers is something that's important, specifically if you have different stages in the animation process. So when you are a cleanup artist, you have to use a separate layer compared to that of your keyframe animator. So with that one, you won't be able to mix and match that, and it would be easier for you to erase and just see your final cleanup line. We also have navigation, so the things that you can do for you to be able to manipulate your canvas. So here are the different shortcuts. We also have sliders, which allows you to control different values of, like, let's say your brush size, opacity, flow, hue, saturation, and a lot more things. On the topmost part, we have our toolbars, which is usually an extension of your tool options. So we have your tool options at the upper right side. We also have our toolbars at the very top, just below your main settings. We also have our Workspace Chooser, which is part of your toolbars, wherein you're allowed to kind of change the environment according to a predefined notion. So usually if you just download Krita, you would have it as a drawing software. But for you to use it as an animation software, you need to have the animation tools, which is usually placed at the bottom. So the Workspace Chooser button would help predefine that for you. So it's better for you to choose that one first and then change the dockers after you have done this one to make it suit your taste a little bit better. Lastly, we have our pop-up palette. This is something that's quite unique to Krita. So it would be easier for you to change your brush. All you have to do is to right click and then change the color. Change the brush type. You can also change the size if you would like to based on this pop-up palette. So that ends my discussion for today, and this is going to be the last synchronous learning session, pre-recorded synchronous learning session for the year. So our next meeting will be on January 4 and 5th the next year. Please be reminded as well that your module 3, however, will be sent to you on Friday. And with that one, I hope you were able to understand a portion of the things that I have discussed in this very long discussion. And with that one, I hope you have a good day ahead and a happy holidays.